corn. Every bottle of bourbon starts here, and the law is specific about it. To be called bourbon, a whiskey has to be made from a grain mixture that is at least 51% corn. That number is a flaw, not a recipe. Most bourbons run well past it. A traditional mash lands somewhere around 70 to 75% corn, because corn is what gives the spirit its sweet, round, full-bodied center. It has a high starch content, which converts into a lot of fermentable sugar, which converts into a lot of alcohol. Everything else in the bottle is built on top of that corn base. The mash bill is the grain recipe, the exact ratio of grains that go into the cook. Corn is the foundation, but the rest of the mash bill is where a distiller decides what kind of bourbon this is going to be. The single biggest fork in that decision is the secondary grain. Use rye, and the whiskey leans spicy and dry. Use wheat instead, and it turns soft and sweet. That is what wheated bourbon means, and it is the recipe behind Maker's Mark, Weller, and Pappy Van Winkle. A high rye bourbon like Bullet runs the other direction, closer to 28% rye with a peppery bite. Same category, completely different whiskey, decided before a single drop is distilled. The flavor grains. Beyond corn, 3 grains do the work. Rye brings spice, pepper, dryness, a kind of backbone no other grain replaces. Wheat is the gentle one. It doesn't add loud flavor so much as it rounds everything off and makes the whiskey feel smoother, even at the same proof. And malted barley earns its place through chemistry rather than taste. Malting means sprouting the grain and then drying it, a process that creates enzymes. Those enzymes are what break the long starch chains down into sugars the yeast can actually eat. Without a little malted barley, the corn and rye have a much harder time becoming alcohol at all. Proof. In the United States, proof is simply twice the alcohol by volume. 100 proof bourbon is 50% alcohol. The math is easy, the origin is stranger. The word goes back to 16th century England, where tax officials needed to know whether a spirit was strong enough to tax at the higher rate. Their test involved gunpowder. They would soak gunpowder in the spirit and try to light it. If it still ignited, the alcohol was strong enough. It was proved. That ignition point sat around 57% alcohol, which the British called 100 proof. When America set its own system in 1848, it picked a rounder definition. 100 proof would equal exactly 50% alcohol. That is the entire reason proof is double the ABV today. Sour mash. Nearly every bourbon on the shelf is a sour mash whiskey, and the name misleads almost everyone. It has nothing to do with sour flavor. Sour mash means that before fermentation, the distiller adds a portion of spent mash left over from the previous batch, called backset, into the new one. That backset is acidic. It lowers the pH, holds off bacteria that could ruin the batch, and keeps every fermentation consistent with the last. The technique is usually credited to Dr. James Crowe, a Scottish chemist and physician trained at Edinburgh who took over distilling at what is now Woodford Reserve in 1838. Crowe probably didn't invent sour mash, but he was the first to run it with real science, measuring pH and sugar decades before anyone around him bothered. His bourbon, Old Crow, became the most popular in the country. Fermentation. Once the grains are cooked and the backset is in, yeast goes to work. The yeast feeds on the sugars and converts them into alcohol, and what comes out the other side is a low-strength beer-like liquid the industry calls distiller's beer. The yeast strain a distillery uses is one of its most guarded secrets. A single strain, kept alive for decades, can be responsible for a house's entire flavor signature. When a distillery loses its yeast, it can lose its identity with it. Distillation. That distiller's beer is fed into a column still, the tall, continuous still, sometimes several stories high, that does most of the heavy lifting in American whiskey. The alcohol vapor rises, gets captured, and condenses back into liquid. Most bourbon then runs through a second, smaller still called a doubler, or a thumper, which refines the spirit and pushes the proof up a little further. Column still first, doubler second. That is the standard path from beer to raw whiskey, the 160 cap. Here the law steps in again. Bourbon cannot be distilled higher than 160 proof. The reason is flavor. The higher you distill a spirit, the more you strip out, push it high enough, and you end up with something closer to neutral, characterless alcohol. By capping distillation at 160 proof, the rule forces bourbon to keep the grain flavor that came out of the cook and the ferment. It is a legal guarantee that there is still corn in the character, not just corn on the label. New make. The clear liquid coming off the still before it has ever touched a barrel has a name, new make or white dog. It is raw, high proof, and completely colorless. Bourbon before bourbon. Some distilleries bottle it and sell it as is, which is a strange thing to taste, because it lets you see exactly how much of a bourbon's color, sweetness, and depth comes not from the grain at all, but from the wood it is about to meet. Entry proof. Before that, new make goes into a barrel. It usually gets cut with a little water to bring the strength down. The level it goes in at is called the entry proof, and the law caps it at 125. Enter the barrel any stronger than that, and it is no longer bourbon. Entry proof matters more than it sounds. It changes how the spirit pulls flavor out of the wood over the years, which is why distillers guard their entry proof number as carefully as their mash bill. The barrel. Bourbon has to be aged in a new charred oak barrel, almost always American white oak and always brand new. It can never be reused for bourbon again, which is why the world's Scotch and rum industries run largely on second-hand bourbon barrels. There is a famous legend about how charring started, that a Baptist preacher named Elijah Craig had a barn fire scorch his barrels around 1789, used them anyway, and accidentally invented bourbon. It is a wonderful story with almost no evidence behind it. The earliest solid record is an 1825 letter from a Lexington grocer telling a distiller to char the inside of his barrels about 1/16 of an inch, because it made the whiskey better. What is certain is that bourbon wasn't even legally defined as its own thing until 1964, when Congress declared it a distinctive product of the United States. Char levels. That charring is measured in levels, 1 through 4. A level 1 char is a quick, light burn. A level 4 is the deepest, a blistered, cracked interior distiller's nickname, alligator char, because the surface looks like reptile skin. The char isn't decoration. It caramelizes the natural sugars in the wood and creates a filter layer, and it is where most of a bourbon's color, its vanilla, and its caramel notes come from. Deeper char, bolder flavor. The barrel is doing as much work as the grain, the angel's share. Then the barrel sits and it waits, and the whiskey slowly disappears. Every year, a portion of the spirit evaporates straight through the wood and into the air. Distillers call this the angel's share. In Kentucky's climate, it runs somewhere between 2 and 4% of the barrel every single year. Over a long maturation, that loss is staggering. An 18-year-old bourbon can give up close to 2/3 of its barrel to evaporation before it is ever bottled. Millions of dollars of finished whiskey every year vanishing into the sky above the rickhouse. The angels take their cut, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. Proofing. When the whiskey finally comes out of the barrel, it is usually too strong to bottle, so the distiller cuts it with water down to the target strength. That step is called proofing. And it is worth knowing exactly what the rules allow to be added to bourbon at this stage. Water and nothing else. No coloring, no flavoring. Water is the only thing that legally goes into the bottle beyond the whiskey itself. Barrel proof. Some bourbons skip that final dilution entirely. When a whiskey is bottled at the exact strength it came out of the barrel with no water added to bring it down, it is called barrel proof or cask strength. These bottlings tend to run hot and intense, often well over 120 proof, because you are drinking the whiskey undiluted, as close to reaching into the barrel as a bottle gets. Hazmat. Push barrel proof high enough and you reach the term collector's love. Bourbon that comes out of the barrel at 140 proof or higher gets jokingly called hazmat. The nickname is literal. At that strength, the whiskey is flammable enough that it legally cannot be carried onto a commercial airplane. It is one of the few bottles of whiskey the federal government classifies alongside actual hazardous materials, bottled in bond. The oldest term on any bourbon label is also the most meaningful, and it exists because of fraud. In the late 1800s, a lot of what was sold as straight whiskey was doctored. Cheap, neutral spirit, colored and flavored with things like iodine, tobacco spit, prune juice, and worse, then passed off as aged bourbon. In response, a group of straight whiskey distillers led by Colonel E. H. Taylor Jr. and James E. Pepper pushed for a federal guarantee, and in 1897 the Bottled in Bond Act was signed into law, often called the first consumer protection law in American history. To wear the words "bottled in bond," a whiskey has to clear a strict bar, the product of one distillery from one distilling season, aged at least 4 years in a federally supervised warehouse, and bottled at exactly 100 proof. When that phrase is on the label, the government is vouching that what is inside is real. The 80 floor, and that is the last number that matters. Bourbon must be bottled at no less than 80 proof, 40% alcohol, and it has to be made in the United States. Put all of it together, and the definition is unusually strict. Made in America, at least 51% corn, distilled no higher than 160 proof, barreled no higher than 125, aged in new charred oak, bottled at no less than 80, with nothing added but water. Most spirits are a style. Bourbon is a promise written into federal law, which is why the word on the bottle means exactly what it says.